My sister-in-law saw my daughter's new teddy bear and went pale, telling me, "You need to throw that bear away tonight. But don't let him know I told you," she whispered, glancing nervously at my brother who was happily playing with all the kids at my daughter Anya's birthday party. I stared at the teddy bear he had given her and wondered what made my sister-in-law so nervous. It was massive and fancy and spoke in a sweet voice when you pressed its paw. The only really strange part was what my brother said to Anya. "Keep it in your room, okay? Make sure it faces you when you sleep. It'll protect her from bad dreams." He turned to me and smiled. "And bad people," he said in a much darker tone, his eyes narrowing into a glare. His wife looked like she was going to be sick when he said that. She kept tugging at his sleeve and saying they needed to leave, but he wouldn't budge. Not until my daughter swore her teddy, Mr. Buttons, would stay with her always. That night, I heard my daughter giggling in her room after bedtime. I smiled, thinking she was playing with the bear instead of sleeping. I stood outside her door listening to her tell Mr. Buttons about her day at school. It was adorable. Then I heard it talk back, not the recorded phrases, but an actual man's voice coming from the bear. "That sounds fun, Anya. You know what else is fun? Playing outside? Do you play outside by yourself sometimes?" My blood went cold. My daughter answered yes, she plays in the backyard after school. "What about when Mommy and Daddy are sleeping? Do you ever go outside then?" the voice asked. I burst through the door and grabbed the bear. Anya gasped. "Daddy, no! You're hurting Mr. Buttons!" she screamed, tears filling her eyes. I heard a small buzzing sound coming from its stomach and felt something electronic inside. "I'm taking this away," I told her, but Anya screamed even louder. "I hate you, Daddy. You hurt Mr. Buttons!" It hurt my heart seeing her so heartbroken over her gift, but her safety came first. I brought the teddy to my room and ripped it open, pulling out the voice recording equipment from its stomach. Then I found something else, a small blinking light on the back of its neck. I cut a small hole and felt sick. Inside the stuffing was a black device about the size of a matchbox with a tiny blinking light. It was definitely a tracker, and not some cheap one either. Military grade from what I could tell Googling it. I called my sister-in-law to tell her what I found, but she didn't sound shocked at all. Instead, she started sobbing and told me, "I found his laptop. There are photos of at least 6 little girls with toys he gave them. I'm packing my things. I can't believe I married a monster." I felt literal chills run up my spine. Just as I was about to call 911, my brother showed up to the house and started pounding on our door aggressively. "Where is she? Is she safe?" he screamed. He started circling our house before stepping inside from the unlocked back door and running straight to my daughter's room. I was getting ready to fight him off when he started checking the window locks and looking under her bed and closet. And I realized that wasn't something a kidnapper did. "Thank God she's safe," he sighed in relief. He fell to the floor, his hands still shaking. "Okay, what's going on? What's up with the stalker bear?" I heard there were a lot of recent abductions in this neighborhood, all girls between 6 and 8, taken from their homes at night. And when I saw a van trailing Anya's school bus, I panicked and bought this tracking bear to hopefully keep her safe. "Then what about that creepy voice recording device? Was that you?" He raised an eyebrow. "Voice recording device?" he asked, like it was the first time he was hearing of it. Just as he opened his mouth, my sister-in-law burst in with 2 police officers who immediately put my brother in handcuffs. "Thank God you're still safe," she said breathlessly, running over to hug me. My brother fought against the police as they dragged him out, shouting, "Sis, that wasn't me. I didn't put the voice recorder in the bear. Wait, check the footage. Your Ring camera. From tonight," he continued shouting as the officers shut the door on him. I pulled up our doorbell app on my phone and started watching with my sister-in-law, trying to figure out what he was so worked up about. Then I spotted it. Around 2 a.m., a van and a mysterious person standing in our yard, looking up at my daughter's room. But that wasn't even the chilling part. When I zoomed into the van, I saw the face of one of the kidnappers. It was my sister-in-law, whose face was lit up just for a second under the moonlight. She sighed, running her hands through her hair, no longer sobbing beside me. How sloppy of me. I should have hidden that voice recorder better. I stared at Brianna sitting calmly on my couch, her whole act completely dropped now. My hands shook as I gripped my phone with the doorbell footage still playing on the screen. One of the officers stepped between us, while the other moved closer to Brianna. She tilted her head slightly and looked right at me with this casual expression that made my stomach turn. The officer asked her to stand up, and she did without fighting, saying something about how she should have been more careful with where she put that voice recorder inside the bear. Her tone was so normal, like she was talking about forgetting to buy milk at the store instead of admitting to planning something horrible. The officer told her she was under arrest and started reading her rights while putting handcuffs on her wrists. I couldn't stop staring at this person I thought I knew, this woman who came to family dinners and birthday parties, realizing I never knew her at all. My phone buzzed with an incoming call, and the officer told me not to answer it yet, that a detective was on the way and would need to see everything. I sat down hard on the chair near the door because my legs felt weak. Brianna looked at me one more time before they walked her toward the front door, and I saw no guilt in her eyes, just annoyance that she got caught. The second officer stayed with me and asked if there was anyone else in the house. I told him my daughter was upstairs sleeping and my brother was still outside somewhere after running around checking the windows. He radioed for backup and said someone would go find Seth and bring him back inside safely. I heard a car pull up fast outside, and then footsteps running up to the door. A middle-aged man with tired eyes and messy gray hair came in holding a badge. He introduced himself as Detective Max Hardy and immediately started giving instructions to the other officers about separating everyone into different rooms. He asked for my phone, and I handed it over, watching him scroll through the doorbell footage with his jaw tight. He looked up at me and said this case just connected to 3 attempted abductions in the area over the past 6 months. My chest felt tight hearing that, knowing how close we came to Anya being number 4. Max asked where my daughter was, and I pointed upstairs. He said he needed to talk to me privately first, and led me into the kitchen. He pulled out a small recorder and set it on the table, then explained that because a tracking device was found in my daughter's room, CPS would be notified as standard procedure to make sure she was safe. I felt anger rise up in my throat and told him I was the one who found the tracker. I was the one who called for help. Why was I being investigated? Max's voice stayed calm, and he said he understood my frustration, but this was protocol anytime a child was in potential danger, that it wasn't about blaming me, but making sure Anya had all the protection she needed. His tone was kind, but firm, and I knew arguing wouldn't change anything, so I just nodded and tried to focus on answering his questions. He asked me to walk him through everything that happened tonight, starting with when Seth gave Anya the bear at her birthday party. I told him about the weird things Seth said, about hearing the man's voice coming from the bear, about finding both the voice recorder and the tracker inside. Max wrote everything down and asked specific questions about times and exact words people said. After about 20 minutes of questions, he told me I could go check on my daughter while he talked to Seth. I practically ran up the stairs to Anya's room and found her sitting up in bed crying. She saw me and asked why everyone took Mr. Buttons away and why there were police cars outside with lights on. I sat on her bed and pulled her close, feeling her small body shaking against mine. I told her as simply as I could that the bear was broken in a way that wasn't safe, that it had parts inside that could hurt her, and we were making sure she was protected now. She asked if she did something wrong, and my heart broke hearing the worry in her voice. I promised her she didn't do anything wrong at all, that grown-ups were handling a problem, and she was completely safe. She cried into my shoulder for a few minutes before asking if she could have a different stuffed animal to sleep with. I grabbed her old teddy from the closet and tucked her back in, staying with her until her breathing got slower and her eyes started closing. When I finally went back downstairs, I saw Seth sitting at the dining table with his head in his hands. An officer was removing his handcuffs and apologizing for the confusion earlier. My brother looked completely destroyed, staring at the spot on the couch where his wife had been sitting just an hour ago. His hands were still shaking, and his eyes were red. I could see him trying to process that the person he trusted most, the person he married and built a life with, was part of something so evil. Max came over and asked Seth to come with him to another room for an interview. Seth stood up slowly like his body weighed 1,000 pounds and followed the detective into my home office. I heard the door close, and then Max's voice starting the recording. While they talked, another officer carefully bagged up all the pieces of Mr. Buttons that I'd torn apart, along with the tracker and voice recorder. He used gloves and put each piece in a separate evidence bag, labeling everything with numbers and times. Max came out about 30 minutes later with Seth following behind him. The detective's face was serious, but not angry, as he explained each step of what would happen next and why it mattered for building a case against whoever was behind this operation. He said they needed to preserve the evidence properly, get fingerprints from everything and trace where the equipment came from. Seth asked what would happen to Brianna, and Max said she was being taken to the station now. Through the window, I could see her sitting in the back of a police car with her face completely blank. Max told us she'd already invoked her right to an attorney and refused to answer any questions, just sitting there stone-faced like she was bored. He said she would be held for at least 48 hours, while they gathered more evidence and determined what charges to file, and that bail would be discussed after her arraignment in a few days. Seth made a sound like someone punched him in the stomach. Max put a hand on his shoulder and said he knew this was hard, but Seth had potentially saved lives tonight by insisting I check that security footage. The officers finally left around 3:30 in the morning, taking all the evidence with them and promising to have extra patrols drive by our house for the next few days. I locked every door and window on the first floor, then went upstairs to check on Anya again. She was awake, sitting up in bed asking questions I didn't know how to answer. Why did Aunt Brianna do something bad? Where was Uncle Seth sleeping tonight? When could she go back to the school? I answered what I could and deflected the rest, finally getting her calm enough to lie back down around 4 a.m. I checked every window lock in her room twice, tested the security system 3 times from my phone, then sat down in the hallway right outside her door. I couldn't bring myself to go to my own room, couldn't let her be alone, even though I knew the danger was gone for now. Every small sound made me jump. Every car passing outside made my heart race. I must have dozed off sitting there because suddenly light was coming through the window at the end of the hall and my neck hurt from the weird angle. I checked my phone and saw it was almost 7 a.m. I stood up quietly and looked in at Anya, who was finally sleeping peacefully. I went downstairs and made coffee with shaking hands, then pulled up the contact list for her school. I called the main office and asked to speak directly to Principal Tucker. When she answered, I explained as calmly as I could that there had been a security threat involving my daughter, and we needed to set up a code word system for pickup immediately. Principal Tucker's voice got serious right away, and she said she would personally notify all the staff and flag Anya's file for extra monitoring. She asked if I wanted to keep Anya home for a few days, and I said yes. That seemed like the safest choice until things settled down. She promised to send all the homework and classwork home and to call me directly if anything seemed off at the school. I thanked her and hung up, feeling slightly better knowing the school was taking this seriously. Around noon, I heard a knock on the door that made me freeze until I looked through the peephole and saw Seth standing there. He looked terrible, like he hadn't slept at all, with dark circles under his eyes and wearing the same clothes from last night. I opened the door, and he asked quietly if he could help in any way, or if I wanted him to stay away from us. Part of me wanted to tell him to leave, to blame him for bringing that bear into our house in the first place, but looking at his face, I could see he was destroyed by what his wife had done. I stepped back and let him in, because despite everything, I knew he had been trying to protect Anya, and we were both victims of Brianna's lies and manipulation. Seth sat down on my couch and put his face in his hands for a long moment before looking up at me. He said he needed to go through his house and check for anything else Brianna might have hidden or left behind. I told him that made sense and offered to come with him, but he shook his head and said he needed to do this alone. He left around 1 in the afternoon, and I spent the rest of the day jumping at every sound and checking on Anya every 20 minutes. That evening, Seth called me, and his voice sounded shaky. He told me he'd gone through every drawer, every closet, every box in their garage like he was investigating a crime scene. In Brianna's car, he found receipts from a mall kiosk for electronics modifications, dated over the past 3 months. There were 5 different receipts, each one for adding special features to stuffed animals or toys. He also found 4 prepaid phones hidden in a box in the back of her closet, phones he'd never seen her use. I felt sick hearing this because it meant she'd been planning this for months, maybe longer. Seth asked if he could bring everything to the police, and I told him to call Max directly. The next morning, I remembered my friend Tony Madden, who works in IT security and does computer forensics for law firms. I called him and explained the situation, asking if he could look at the tracker and voice recorder before we handed them to the police. Tony came over that afternoon with a laptop and a bunch of equipment I didn't understand. He carefully took photos of everything and created what he called forensic images, which were exact copies of all the data on the devices. Tony spent almost an hour examining the tracker, and when he looked up, his face was serious. He explained this was military-grade equipment that probably cost several $1,000s, way more than some random criminal would spend. He said whoever bought this had serious money and resources behind them. That made everything feel even more scary because we weren't dealing with just one sick person. We were dealing with something organized and professional. Tony helped me package everything properly for the police, and I drove it to the station myself that afternoon. Max called me that night around 10, and I could hear typing in the background while he talked. He said they'd traced the voice recorder purchase through an online marketplace. The shipping information led back to a local package drop box at a convenience store about 15 minutes from my house. They were pulling surveillance footage from that location to try to identify who picked up the package. He told me this was good progress, but to stay alert, because they still didn't know how many people were involved. I barely slept that night, getting up every hour to check the security system and look out the windows. The next morning, a woman named Mila Royce showed up at my door at 9, carrying a clipboard. She introduced herself as a CPS caseworker assigned to our case. I knew this was coming because Max had warned me, but I still felt defensive and angry, having to prove I was a good parent. Mila walked through our entire house, inspecting every lock on every window and door. She checked our security cameras, asked about our emergency procedures, and wanted to know who had keys to our house. She wasn't mean about it, but I could tell she was evaluating everything I said and did. She asked to see Anya's room and spent a long time looking at the window locks and asking questions about our bedtime routine. After almost 2 hours, Mila sat down at my kitchen table and started writing up what she called a formal safety plan. She made me document exactly who was authorized to pick up Anya from the school, including their full names and phone numbers. We had to establish emergency contacts and agree to regular check-ins with CPS until the threat was fully handled. Mila explained that CPS would be monitoring our situation closely, and I needed to report any changes or concerns immediately. I signed everything she put in front of me, feeling like I was punished for someone else's crimes. She left around noon, and I felt exhausted and frustrated. Later that afternoon, Seth showed up again with a laptop. He explained that months ago when Brianna upgraded her phone, he'd backed up all her data to their home computer, just in case she needed to restore anything. He thought maybe there was something useful in that backup. I called Tony, and he came back over to take a look. Tony spent over an hour going through the phone backup, while Seth and I sat there watching. Finally, Tony stopped and called us over to look at the screen. Hidden among all the normal apps was something that looked like a calculator, but Tony said it was actually disguised messaging software. When he opened it, there were dozens of messages between Brianna and someone labeled only as handler. The messages were careful and used code words, but it was clear they were coordinating something. Tony took screenshots of everything and said this was major evidence. Around 4 that afternoon, my next-door neighbor knocked on my door. She looked nervous and apologetic, holding her phone in her hand. She said she'd been reviewing her own doorbell camera footage after hearing police were in the neighborhood. Her camera had caught the same suspicious van that showed up at my house, but it had driven slowly past our block on 3 different mornings over the past 2 weeks. She felt terrible that she hadn't reported it sooner, but she'd just assumed it was a lost delivery driver or someone looking for an address. I thanked her and immediately forwarded the footage to Max. He called back within an hour, sounding energized. He said he'd traced the van's license plate and it came back to a short-term rental company downtown. The rental agreement was under a business name that led to a shell corporation with a fake address. Max explained this level of planning and organization meant we were dealing with a coordinated group, not just one person acting alone. Somehow that made everything more scary, because it meant there were multiple people out there working together. That night, Max came to our house with recording equipment and a script. He wanted Seth to call Brianna's number, while police listened and recorded everything. They coached Seth on what to say, telling him to act worried and ask what they wanted from him. Seth's hands were shaking as he dialed, and I could hear Brianna's voice through the speaker when she answered. Seth asked her what they wanted, and if they were watching him now. There was a long pause before Brianna responded. She told Seth the others were always watching, and he should be very careful about what he said to anyone. Her voice sounded cold and threatening, nothing like the woman I thought I knew. Max gave Seth a thumbs up, and they ended the call. I was putting Anya to bed around 8:30 when my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. The message said, "Anya likes the swings at Riverside Park after school on Tuesdays." I felt like someone punched me in the stomach because that was exactly her routine. I immediately called Max and forwarded him the message. He told me to stay inside, lock everything, and he was sending a patrol car to watch our house tonight. The next morning, my phone rang while I was making breakfast, and I saw the school's number on the screen. Principal Tucker's voice sounded tight when I answered. She told me that yesterday afternoon, a woman came to the main office asking very specific questions about dismissal times and which doors the kids used to leave. The office staff didn't give out any information because they followed the safety protocols, but the woman kept pushing and asking about Anya specifically. The principal described her as having dark hair and wearing sunglasses, which matched Brianna's general look. My hands started shaking as I thanked her and hung up. Someone was actively trying to get close to my daughter at the school. I called Max right away, and he said he'd arrange for extra police patrols near the school and our house. That afternoon, I drove to the hardware store and bought motion sensor lights for every side of our house and window alarms for Anya's room and the other ground floor windows. I spent 3 hours installing everything while checking over my shoulder constantly. Every car that drove down our street made me tense up. Every person walking their dog looked suspicious. I heard a trash can fall over in the neighbor's yard, and I actually jumped and grabbed a hammer before realizing it was just the wind. I was becoming paranoid about normal neighborhood sounds, and I knew it, but I couldn't stop myself from checking and rechecking every lock and sensor. Seth called that evening to tell me he'd gone to Brianna's arraignment at the courthouse. He sounded exhausted and confused as he described how her attorney stood up and claimed Brianna had been forced into cooperating with the ring because she owed gambling debts to dangerous people. The lawyer said Brianna's family had been threatened, and she felt trapped with no way out. Seth told me he sat there in the courtroom watching this stranger defend his wife with lies, but part of him wondered if maybe he never really knew Brianna at all. How could he have missed something this big? How could he have shared a bed with someone capable of hurting kids and never seen any signs? His voice cracked when he said he kept replaying their entire marriage in his head, trying to figure out what he missed. The judge set bail at $50,000 and scheduled a preliminary hearing for next month. Seth said he wasn't posting bail, and Brianna would stay in jail until trial. Later that night, Tony called with an update on his forensic work. He'd been going through all the audio files stored on the voice recording device and found something disturbing in the background of several recordings. There was a second male voice that you could barely hear, like someone standing further away from the microphone. Tony cleaned up the audio and played a section for me over the phone. I heard the original voice asking Anya questions, but underneath it, I could make out a man's voice coaching the questions. The second voice would say things like, ask about the backyard or find out about her schedule. Tony explained this meant Brianna definitely wasn't working alone, and someone had been training her or directing how to talk to Anya. The voice was too distorted to identify who it was, but it confirmed there was at least one more person actively involved in planning whatever they wanted to do to my daughter. Max called the next morning with more information from his tech team. They'd pulled the complete location history from the tracker device and found an interesting pattern. The tracker had pinged repeatedly at the same spot near an industrial warehouse on the east side of town. The pings happened on 6 different nights over the past 3 weeks, always between midnight and 3 in the morning. Max said the pattern suggested the warehouse might be a meeting place or storage location for the operation. It was too specific and too regular to be random. His team was working on getting building records and ownership information for that address. He told me they were setting up discreet surveillance on the warehouse starting tonight, with the limited officers and equipment they could spare. They'd put up cameras to monitor who came and went, and track any vehicles that showed up there. Max's voice got serious when he warned me this was going to be a long process. They needed to build a solid case against everyone involved, not just arrest one person and let the others disappear. He said I needed to be patient and trust that they were doing everything possible to keep Anya safe while gathering evidence. 2 days later, Mila showed up for her second CPS visit, carrying a thick folder of paperwork. She sat at our kitchen table and made me walk through safety drills with Anya while she watched and took notes. I had to demonstrate what Anya should do if a stranger approached her at the school or in the neighborhood. We practiced using our family code word that only the 3 of us knew, so Anya would know if someone was really sent by me or if they were lying. Mila made me document everything in writing with dates and times and signatures. I felt completely exhausted by the constant scrutiny and paperwork. I understood they were trying to protect my daughter, but it felt like I was investigated instead of helped. Every question Mila asked felt like an accusation that I wasn't doing enough or wasn't being careful enough. I signed all the forms and scheduled the next check-in for 2 weeks out. That evening, Seth came over, and we sat down to have a difficult conversation about his contact with Anya going forward. I told him clearly that visits would be supervised only from now on. He couldn't take her anywhere without me present. He couldn't give her any gifts without my approval first, and he needed to be completely transparent about anything related to Brianna or the investigation. Seth nodded and agreed to everything without arguing. He said he understood he needed to rebuild trust slowly and prove he could keep Anya safe. He looked broken sitting there on my couch, like he'd aged 10 years in the past week. I felt bad for him because I knew he'd been trying to protect Anya when he bought that bear, but trust had to be earned back through actions, not words. The next afternoon, Max called with another discovery from his investigation. His team had pulled traffic camera footage from around our neighborhood and found the suspicious van driving past 3 different elementary schools in our district over the past month. The van would cruise slowly past the schools around dismissal time, then circle back and drive past again. The systematic pattern made it clear this wasn't random. The ring had been watching multiple schools and surveilling different potential targets. They were choosing victims based on things like how easy it would be to access them and how vulnerable they seemed. Max said this level of planning and organization was extremely concerning because it meant they'd put serious thought and effort into finding the right kids to target. Seth stopped by again that evening looking agitated and said he needed to tell me something he just remembered. Over the past few months, Brianna had started organizing toy drives and donation collections through her book club and neighborhood groups. She'd been asking people to donate gently used stuffed animals and toys for underprivileged kids. At the time, Seth thought it was a nice charitable thing, but now it seemed like the perfect cover for distributing modified toys to other families without raising suspicion. Seth pulled out his phone and started going through Brianna's contacts, writing down names and numbers of everyone in those social circles. He handed me a list of about 15 people who'd been involved in the toy drives. I immediately forwarded everything to Max, so his team could contact those families and check if any of them had received suspicious toys from Brianna. Max called 2 days later with news about the warrant. The online marketplace handed over access to the shipping locker where someone picked up the voice recorder package. His team pulled fingerprints from the packaging tape inside the locker and ran them through the system. The prints didn't match Brianna's at all. Max said this proved someone else touched that package and was directly involved in modifying the bear. I felt my stomach twist, knowing there was at least one more person out there who'd been in my daughter's room through that device. That afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table examining what was left of Mr. Buttons, turning the torn fabric over in my hands. Something caught my eye on the inside of the bear's brown fur. There was a small rectangle of sticky residue like someone had peeled off a sticker or tag. I grabbed my phone and took several close-up photos of the residue from different angles. The outline was too perfect to be random. It looked exactly like those repair tags you see on stuffed animals that get fixed at mall kiosks. I texted the photos to Max with a message suggesting the bear might have been modified at a legitimate repair shop that could have customer records. He responded within minutes saying that was solid thinking, and he'd follow up on it. The next morning, Max and another detective visited the electronics kiosk at our local mall. They brought printed photos of Brianna and showed them to the clerk working there. The guy recognized her right away. He told the detectives she'd come in multiple times over the past few months, with a tall man to have smart features added to several stuffed animals. The clerk remembered because most people just wanted simple voice boxes installed, but these two wanted custom audio systems with remote access capabilities. Max said the clerk seemed nervous when he realized what the modifications were probably used for. The mall security office pulled footage going back 3 months after Max explained it was part of an active investigation. The videos showed Brianna and a man in his 40s entering the kiosk at least 6 different times. Max finally had visual proof of an accomplice and immediately sent the footage to his tech team to run facial recognition. He called me that evening sounding more energized than I'd heard him in days. He said they were making real progress identifying the network behind this. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. My mind kept replaying everything I knew about Brianna. She wasn't some criminal mastermind who planned this whole operation. She was recruited into something that already existed. Someone found her and convinced her to use her family connections to provide access to potential victims. The betrayal felt even worse knowing she made a choice to put Anya at risk. She looked at my daughter at birthday parties and family dinners and saw an opportunity instead of a niece. I rolled over and checked my phone. It was almost 3 a.m. Then our security system alarm started blaring through the whole house. I jumped out of bed and grabbed my phone to check the app. A motion sensor at Anya's bedroom window was going crazy. I ran down the hall shouting for my wife to call 911. Seth had been sleeping on our couch since everything happened, and he was already running outside with a baseball bat before I made it to the stairs. I burst into Anya's room, and she was sitting up in bed crying from the noise. I pulled her close and checked the window. Someone had been trying to pry it open from outside. I could see fresh scratches on the frame. Seth came back inside, breathing hard, and said whoever it was disappeared into the darkness between houses. He never got close enough to see anything useful. The police arrived within 10 minutes and searched our yard with flashlights. They found fresh tool marks on Anya's window frame where someone used a crowbar or similar tool. One of the officers called Max, even though it was the middle of the night. Max showed up 30 minutes later in sweatpants and a jacket looking grim. His team found a partial fingerprint on the glass that didn't match anyone in their system. Max pulled me aside and said, "This near miss changed everything. Someone was getting desperate enough to try a direct approach. We needed to change our tactical plan because waiting around was too dangerous now." The next afternoon, Seth sat at my kitchen table with Brianna's phone and the disguised messaging app open. Max stood behind him, coaching every single word he typed. They worked together to craft careful texts that sounded like Brianna proposing a meeting to deliver the new drop. Seth's hands shook as he typed asking for location and time details. Max made him rewrite the message 3 times to get the tone exactly right. They sent it, and Max said we just had to wait and see if the handler took the bait. I paced around my living room feeling useless while they stared at the phone. Less than an hour later, the phone buzzed with a response. The handler sent instructions to bring the package to Riverside Park the following morning at 10 a.m. The message said to come alone. Max immediately started making calls to coordinate an undercover operation. He warned me this could be dangerous, and I needed to stay completely out of it. I wanted to argue, but I knew he was right. My phone rang while Max was still coordinating with his team. It was Mila from CPS. Her voice was stern and direct. She said CPS could not support any plan that put me or my family at risk. I needed to follow police instructions exactly without trying to be directly involved in any operation. Her tone made it very clear that my cooperation with authorities was watched and documented as part of their safety assessment. I told her I understood and hung up feeling like I was monitored from every direction. Max called back 20 minutes later and said we needed to leave immediately. I started throwing clothes into suitcases while my wife grabbed Anya's favorite stuffed animals and books. Seth helped carry bags to the car and kept checking the windows like someone might be watching us right now. Anya came downstairs rubbing her eyes and asking why we were packing in the middle of the night. I knelt down and told her we were going on a special adventure to a hotel with a pool. Her face lit up and she ran to get her swimsuit. The lie made my stomach hurt, but keeping her calm was more important than honesty right now. 2 patrol cars followed us across town to a hotel near the highway. Max was already in the lobby talking to the manager when we arrived. He handed me a key card and said his team would be stationed in the parking lot all night. The room had 2 beds and a view of the pool that was closed and dark. Anya pressed her face against the window and asked if we could swim in the morning. I said maybe, and helped her change into pajamas while trying to act like this was normal and fun. My wife unpacked our toothbrushes and lined up Anya's stuffed animals on the bed the way she liked them at home. Seth sat in the corner chair looking exhausted and guilty. That night, I read Anya 3 stories and checked under the hotel bed with her, even though we both knew there was nothing there. She giggled when I made a big show of looking in the closet and behind the curtains. Then she asked when we could go home, and her voice got small and scared. I promised soon and kissed her forehead while having absolutely no idea if that was true. She fell asleep, holding her purple elephant peanut close to her chest. I sat on the edge of the bed watching her breathe and feeling my phone buzz with updates from Max every 30 minutes. Around midnight, my wife finally convinced me to try sleeping, but I just stared at the ceiling, listening to every footstep in the hallway outside our room. The next morning, Max called to say Brianna's attorney had contacted him about a potential plea deal. She wanted to provide information about the operation in exchange for reduced charges. Max explained this happened all the time in cases like this, but warned me that her cooperation might be more about strategy than actual remorse. I asked if that meant she would get less prison time, and he said probably, but it also meant we might finally understand how big this operation really was. 2 hours later, Max called again with bigger news. Police had executed a search warrant on a storage unit registered under the Shell Corporation. Inside, they found boxes of modified stuffed animals, hidden cameras still in packaging, and printed tracking logs with addresses and schedules. The evidence was serious, but Max said there were no photos or videos of actual victims, which suggested the ring was still in the surveillance and planning stages. That thought made me feel sick, because it meant we had caught them right before they were ready to actually take children. Max sent me photos of the storage unit, and I saw rows of teddy bears and dolls lined up on metal shelves like some nightmare toy store. Each one had a small tag with a name and age written in neat handwriting. Max called again that afternoon to say the tracking logs from the other toys showed patterns around 3 elementary schools and 2 public parks in our area. His team was starting the process of identifying which families had received these toys and notifying them about the danger. I thought about all those parents who had no idea their kids were being watched and tracked. Max said it would take days to contact everyone and coordinate with other agencies. Meanwhile, Seth was sitting at my kitchen table on his phone looking pale. He said he needed to call his parents before they heard about this from someone else. I sat next to him as he dialed and listened to him try to explain that his wife was involved in planning child abductions. His voice kept breaking, and he had to start over twice. His dad stayed silent on the other end for so long that Seth asked if he was still there. Finally, his dad said he needed time to process this and hung up. Seth put his phone down and covered his face with his hands. I didn't know what to say, so I just sat there with him. That same day, Max identified the male accomplice from the mall footage. He had a prior conviction for child endangerment in another state and had been on a watch list. Max was coordinating with a regional task force that had been tracking similar patterns of surveillance and grooming across multiple counties. He said this was bigger than just our neighborhood and possibly connected to cases in 3 other states. The scope of it made me feel dizzy. While all this was happening, I sat down at the hotel desk and wrote a letter to Anya. I dated it and sealed it in an envelope that I planned to give her when she was older. The letter explained in simple terms what had happened and why we had to be so careful. Writing it helped me process my own fear without putting that weight on her right now. I wrote about how much we loved her and how hard we worked to keep her safe. Then I put the letter in my suitcase under my clothes, where it would stay until the right time. The morning of the sting operation, I woke up at dawn feeling like I might throw up. Max had positioned undercover officers throughout Riverside Park, dressed as joggers and dog walkers. A female detective was going to pose as Brianna from a distance, wearing similar clothes and a wig. Max explained the plan 3 times to make sure I understood that I needed to stay at the hotel and wait for his call. At exactly 10 in the morning, I was pacing the hotel room while my wife tried to distract Anya with cartoons. My phone stayed silent for 20 minutes that felt like hours. Then Max called and said the arrest had happened smoothly, without incident. A man had approached the meeting spot carrying a backpack, and officers moved in to intercept him before he realized it was a trap. The man was the handler from the mall footage. Max said he immediately asked for a lawyer and refused to say anything. But Max's voice sounded relieved when he told me the immediate threat was contained. He cautioned that they were still gathering information about the full scope of the operation, but the person who had been actively targeting our neighborhood was now in custody. I hung up and told my wife and Seth what happened. For the first time in days, I felt like I could actually breathe. Max called back an hour later with more news about what they found in the arrested man's car. The back seat was full of notebooks, with detailed maps of our neighborhood and 2 others nearby. He had written down when parents left for work, which kids walked to the bus stop alone, and which houses had security cameras. Max's voice sounded different when he explained this part, tight and controlled, like he was working hard to stay professional. The man had notes on at least 6 different families with young daughters, including ours. He'd tracked school schedules, after-school activities, even which nights garbage went out. Max said they were lucky the operation was still in the planning stage and no actual abductions had happened yet. The word lucky felt wrong, but I understood what he meant. 2 days later, Max called to tell me Brianna's bail had been pulled completely. The judge reviewed all the new evidence from the vehicle search and the warehouse surveillance and decided she was too much of a risk to release. Her lawyer was already talking about a deal where she'd give information about the other people involved in exchange for lighter charges. Max said she was claiming the handler found her through some online group and used her money problems to pull her in. I didn't know if that was true or just another lie to make herself look better. Part of me didn't care anymore what her reasons were. Seth showed up at the hotel 3 days after the arrest, looking worse than I'd ever seen him. He said he'd already talked to a lawyer about divorce papers and was moving his stuff into a small apartment across town. He explained he needed to completely separate from Brianna to process what happened and to show everyone he could be trusted again. I watched him sitting on the edge of the hotel bed with his head down and his hands shaking slightly. He asked if I thought Anya would ever forgive him for bringing danger into her life, even though he didn't know. I told him kids were better at forgiveness than adults, but it would take time. He nodded and said he understood. Before he left, he wrote down his new address and told me to call anytime, day or night, if we needed anything. Mila from CPS came by the hotel the next morning with her clipboard and that same serious expression. She went through every safety measure we'd put in place, asked about the police protection we'd received, and spent 20 minutes talking to Anya alone in the bathroom. When she came out, she told me she was closing the active investigation, but we'd have quarterly check-ins for the next year to make sure everything stayed stable. She handed me a thick folder of resources about childhood trauma and safety planning. I signed more papers and watched her pack up her things. She stopped at the door and said we'd done everything right, and Anya was lucky to have parents who acted so fast. It was the first time she'd said anything that felt like approval. We moved back home 4 days later, and that first night back, I noticed Anya couldn't fall asleep. She kept coming out of her room asking for water or saying she heard noises, or just standing in the hallway looking scared. This went on for 3 nights in a row. She started crying when I dropped her off at the school and asking if I'd be there to pick her up. I called the school counselor and set up appointments for twice a week. The counselor told me she worked specifically with kids who'd been through scary situations and that with support, most kids bounced back really well. She said Anya's reactions were completely normal and we'd work through them together. 2 weeks after everything happened, Seth asked if we could talk, and I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop near his new apartment. We sat outside at a metal table, and he spent an hour going through all the ways he'd missed signs about Brianna's behavior. She'd been secretive with her phone, had unexplained errands, seemed nervous around Anya sometimes. He kept saying he should have noticed, should have asked more questions, should have protected his niece better. I told him none of us saw it coming, and that predators were good at hiding what they really were. He said he was working on being more aware and more careful, but he knew rebuilding trust with the family would take a long time. I agreed it would take time, but that I believed he genuinely wanted to do better. Max stopped by the house that same week for what he called a final update. He sat at our kitchen table with a folder of papers and explained that the investigation had uncovered a bigger network operating across multiple counties. The case was handed over to a federal group that handled this kind of thing. He promised the immediate threat to our neighborhood was gone, and both Brianna and the handler were facing serious charges that would keep them locked up for years. He said the federal team would probably contact us later for more detailed statements, but for now we could try to get back to normal life. Normal felt like a word from a different lifetime, but I thanked him anyway. That afternoon, I asked Anya if she wanted to help me with something important. We took Mr. Buttons and the other electronic toys and put them in a big garbage bag together. She held the bag while I tied it shut. Then we drove to the store, and I let her pick out any regular stuffed animal she wanted as a replacement. She walked up and down the toy aisle for 10 minutes before choosing a soft purple elephant with floppy ears. On the drive home, she hugged it close and told me his name was Peanut, and that Peanut didn't need to talk or have lights or do anything except be soft. I said that sounded perfect. That evening after dinner, I sat down with Anya on her bed and told her I was sorry the past few weeks had been so scary and confusing. She looked at me with those big eyes and said she wasn't mad at me, but she really missed when things felt normal and boring. She said she didn't like all the police and questions and sleeping at the hotel. Her forgiveness was simple and instant in the way only kids could manage. It hurt my heart and gave me hope at the same time. We read 3 stories together, and she fell asleep holding Peanut close. Seth called a few days later to tell me he was writing a statement for the court about how Brianna's actions affected him and our family. He'd also started seeing a therapist twice a week to work through the betrayal and his own guilt about not seeing the danger sooner. He said he'd told his parents and siblings they weren't allowed to talk about Brianna around him or ask him to forgive her or suggest he should have known. He needed clear boundaries to move forward. I told him I was proud of him for taking those steps and for being honest about needing help. A few days later, I got an email from our neighborhood association about a community safety meeting scheduled for that Thursday evening. Max would be presenting information about toy surveillance and warning signs to watch for. I showed up at the community center and found about 30 parents already seated in folding chairs, looking nervous and angry. Max stood at the front with a laptop and projector, his expression serious but calm. He walked everyone through the investigation, explaining how modified toys worked and what red flags to notice. He showed examples of tracking devices and hidden cameras without being too graphic or scary. Several parents raised their hands with questions about their own kids' toys, and Max patiently explained how to check for unusual weight, battery compartments that seemed too large, or electronics that didn't match the toy's advertised features. One mom mentioned her daughter received a tablet from a distant relative that had weird permissions enabled, and Max took down her information to follow up. By the end of the meeting, we'd created a shared contact list and divided the neighborhood into zones for a rotating watch schedule. Parents volunteered to walk certain streets during school pickup times and keep an eye out for unfamiliar vehicles. It felt good to do something active instead of just waiting and worrying. The next morning, I met with Principal Tucker in her office at Anya's school. She had a folder of new policies spread across her desk, all focused on visitor screening and dismissal procedures. Anyone picking up a student would need to show ID and match the approved list, with no exceptions even for family members unless they were pre-authorized. Teachers would escort students to designated pickup zones instead of letting them walk out alone. The school would also install additional security cameras at all entrances and exits. Principal Tucker looked at me carefully and asked if I'd be comfortable with the school using our situation as a teaching example for other families, without using any names or identifying details. She wanted to send a letter home explaining the new policies and why they mattered, referencing a recent local incident that highlighted these dangers. I thought about it for a minute and then agreed, figuring if our nightmare could protect even one other family, it would be worth the discomfort. She thanked me and promised to keep everything confidential while still making the message clear. 3 weeks passed in a blur of routines and careful vigilance. One evening, I stood in our kitchen making spaghetti, while Anya sat at the table coloring with Peanut propped up next to her paper. She was humming a song from the school and telling Peanut about her friend's birthday party coming up next month. I stirred the sauce and listened to her chatter, feeling something shift in my chest. She laughed at a video playing on the tablet, a genuine giggle that sounded completely carefree. I realized I wasn't holding my breath anymore, wasn't listening for strange sounds or checking the windows every 5 minutes. The constant tension that had lived in my shoulders for weeks felt looser, more manageable. We were still careful and aware, but the sharp edge of panic had dulled into something I could actually live with. That night, Anya went to bed without asking about locked doors or bad people, just requesting her usual 2 stories and a glass of water. A few days later, an official letter arrived from the district attorney's office with the final sentencing details. Brianna had been formally sentenced to 8 years in prison with mandated counseling and cooperation requirements. The letter explained that her testimony had already helped identify 2 other members of the ring, leading to arrests in neighboring counties. I read through the legal language twice, trying to process that this person who'd sat in my home and hugged me while lying had gotten less than a decade for trying to help kidnap children. The prosecutor's note at the bottom explained that the cooperation agreement was necessary to dismantle the larger network, and without her testimony, the other members might have stayed hidden. I understood the logic, but still felt sick about it. Seth started coming by more often for supervised visits with Anya, and I watched carefully as they rebuilt their relationship through simple activities. The first few times, they just colored together at the kitchen table while I stayed in the room, and Anya was polite, but distant. She'd hand him crayons when he asked and answer his questions about school, but there was a careful space between them. Gradually, over several visits, she started warming up as his consistency proved he was safe and reliable. They moved from coloring to playing board games, then to trips to the playground where I sat on a bench watching them on the swings. Seth never pushed for more time or complained about the supervision. He just showed up when he said he would and followed whatever boundaries I set. 6 weeks after everything started, I woke up in the middle of the night out of habit and checked my phone. It was almost 7 in the morning, and Anya's room was completely quiet. I walked to her door and opened it slowly, expecting to find her awake or restless like usual. Instead, she was curled up under her blankets with Peanut tucked under one arm, breathing deeply and peacefully. She'd slept through the entire night without nightmares for the first time since the bear incident. I checked on her 2 more times that morning, unable to quite believe it, but each time she was still sleeping soundly. Seeing her peaceful face reminded me that we were genuinely healing and moving past the worst of it. I found an online support group for parents whose children had been targeted by predators, and reading through their posts made me feel less alone. These were people who understood the specific fear of knowing someone had watched your child, planned to hurt them, gotten close enough to make it real. I started sharing our story in small pieces, and other parents responded with their own experiences and advice about therapy, security measures, and helping kids feel safe again. Their stories of recovery gave me hope that we'd continue getting stronger instead of staying stuck in this fearful place. Some families were years past their incidents and doing well, their kids thriving and resilient. That possibility felt important to hold on to. A thick envelope arrived from the federal task force about a week later, official letterhead and formal language thanking our family for the evidence and cooperation that helped dismantle a network operating across 4 states. They'd recovered over 30 modified toys from various families and prevented multiple planned abductions based on the information we provided. Reading those numbers made everything we'd gone through feel less pointless. Our nightmare had meaning if it stopped other families from experiencing the same terror. The letter included a contact number if we ever needed additional support or had questions about the ongoing investigation. 3 months after the night I ripped open Mr. Buttons, our daily routines finally felt stable again. We had new security measures that felt protective instead of paranoid. Motion sensors on all the windows, a monitored alarm system, and cameras covering every angle of the property. Anya knew her pickup code word and the rules about strangers, but she wasn't scared all the time anymore. She was thriving in the school with the counselor's support, bringing home good grades and talking about friends and normal kid problems. I still checked the locks twice before bed, and probably always would. I still felt my heart speed up when an unfamiliar car parked on our street, but I also knew we'd faced something terrible together and come through it safer, closer, and genuinely okay. We'd learned to be careful without being paralyzed by fear. We'd built a community of people watching out for each other, and we'd proven that even when trust gets shattered, it's possible to carefully rebuild it into something stronger. So that's the full timeline from birthday party to federal investigation to recovery. Key takeaways: check toys for unusual weight or electronics, establish pickup code words with your kids, trust your gut when something feels off, and document everything. If this breakdown of how they caught a trafficking ring was helpful, subscribe for more stories that show you the actual warning signs and response systems. Stay vigilant out there.